Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Black Sheep Tribune podcast. My name is Teague, and I am your host, and here I talk about true crime stories that you may have never heard of because everyone's story matters. Okay, so before I get into today's episode, I have a few things that I would like to talk about. One of them being the coup that was attempted in the first month of this year. I can't say that I was absolutely surprised by people storming the Capitol building. It was very interesting to see it happen, like on the news and stuff like that. But I wasn't necessarily surprised by it. And it was just one of those things where I was just like, sometimes you just gotta let white people be white people. As a black person, I felt like I didn't have much to say about what was happening with that situation, other than it was just a very gross display of white privilege. Had those been Black Lives Matter protesters, they easily would have been shot at, whether that be with like actual ammo or like rubber bullets or tear gas. Yeah, so other than that, I don't have a lot to say about it. I just did want to mention that that happened because it was absolutely ridiculous that that happened, and just the way that those, I hate to even call them protesters, but the way that those people were treated by law enforcement compared to the way that Black Lives Matter protesters were treated by law enforcement back when the protests were more prevalent and things like that. It was really sad to see that. I feel like that's something that it's like that's how that would go had the like roles been reversed, like with things like the Black Lives Matter protests and stuff. But it's absolutely disgusting to see that happen in front of your face. I saw cops helping them down the stairs of the Capitol building. We know that they were let in to get either closer or actually into the Capitol building by law enforcement. And yeah, it's absolutely disgusting to see how differently people are treated just based off of the color of their skin. And like I said, it's not something that I didn't already know clearly, but it's still really fucking gross to see it happen in front of your face. I am happy to see that many of them are being arrested now. That is one thing that I was kind of surprised by, honestly. Well, not surprised by, but a little bit. I was surprised to see different states and law enforcement to actually go through with finding and picking up these people that stormed the Capitol building. The one thing that I will say about that is that I am happy that those people have been arrested and possibly are still being arrested. But I am seeing much special treatment and much lighter punishments being given to them than what they necessarily deserve, in my opinion. I think we all probably know about the one Capitol rider or stormer, whatever, that was wearing the like bison hat. Yeah, so he got arrested and was refusing to eat the food unless it was organic food, and they actually got organic food for him, which is something that, in my opinion, would absolutely never be done for a Black Lives Matter protester or anything like that. And I can't remember specifically what other case, but I know that there have been certain ones that are getting off with lighter sentences compared to what they would probably get if they were a Black Lives Matter protester. So it's good to see them arrested, but at the same time, it's almost performative when they're getting off much easier than other people would be. Moving on from that. Oh, so I came out at work. Kind of. I mean, I am out at work. I just didn't make like any big announcement about it or anything like that. So that's why I say like kind of, but I am out at work now, which is good. Being out has come with its own set of challenges, just like being like in the closet did. Some of them I expected and some of them I didn't expect, which I just feel like you can't always know exactly what you're getting into until you actually do it. One of the hardest things for me so far has not really been people like messing up with my name and pronouns and stuff like that, because I know everyone's still getting used to it. It's more just like there are comments that people make to you, or ignorant questions that people ask you. And not that it's ever, or not that they're all out of malicious intent or anything like that. I think people are just very uneducated on the subject of gender. So they don't always know how to communicate about things like that. So not that it's like anyone's fault necessarily, but it is still tough to hear to hear certain things that I have heard. And again, it's like I expected some of the comments that I've heard and questions that I've gotten, but it's still kind of weird because it's like you expect them, but you don't know exactly who they're gonna come from all the time. And I work with so many people that it's hard to know like what everyone's reaction is going to be and that type of thing. So yeah, not the worst thing I've ever been through. But I will definitely sit here and say that it is not easy. Having to talk to a bunch of people that do not look like you and are not like you as far as my gender expression or my gender identity and stuff. And trying to explain my gender identity to people who have no experience like questioning their own gender identity. It's something that I try to be open with them about because I don't want this to be like weird forever. But at the same time, since I have been getting like ignorant comments and questions, at this point I'm kind of like, if you have questions, Google that shit. I am not a human walking Google. If you have questions, they can more than likely be answered by you researching. So yeah, so I just want to say that I hope that you are doing okay. It's insane to me that it has already been a year since this pandemic started, or that we were alerted about it starting, I guess. So I hope that you are healthy and your family and everyone who's important to you is healthy. Hope you're doing okay. And even if you are struggling, I hope that this podcast can be a little bit of a break for you. Not saying that we talk about fun stuff here. True crime content is obviously very dark, but hopefully it at least gives you a little bit of a break from what is going on with you personally. So this episode is going to be a little bit different from the things I have the cases that I have previously covered. In most of the episodes that I do and most of the stories that I cover, I very much like to focus on the victims and make it much more about them rather than the killer. Just because I feel like most times we focus in a lot on the killer and his MO and how long he was active, all this, all that. Or they were active, not that men are only killers. But I usually like to focus in a lot more on the victims and the kind of lives that they led previous to interacting with their killer or if they were assaulted by the killer or anything like that. This episode is not going to be one of those. This episode is going to be very much focused on the killer. His name is Andre Thomas. I actually first heard of this case from True Crime All the Time, which is another true crime podcast that you can find pretty much anywhere. If you have not checked them out, it is hosted by Mike Ferguson and Mike Gibson. I like them both very much. They're very funny. They're a very good pair together. So if you haven't heard their podcast, go check them out. They are great. And that is where I originally found this case. So I definitely want to give them credit where credit is due. And even though Andre is not the victim of this case, I still found it very important to cover because of the things that he deals with and the way that his case was handled. But I do always like to say before covering this case that he is not the victim of this case. I am in no way trying to paint him as a victim of this case. The things that he did that I will go into here in a bit are very gruesome and very horrific. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm sitting here and saying, oh, poor Andre, because he did do horrible things that I'm about to cover in a few minutes. Like I mentioned, this case is very gruesome. That is always something I like to point out with this case. And I know you're probably sitting there like, okay, like this is a true crime podcast. Like this is what we're here for. We're here for that gruesome shit. Okay, I get it. But this is the most gruesome case that I have ever covered. And the most gruesome one that I can think of off the top of my head. just in the ones that I've come across in general, not only the ones that I have actually like researched and covered. So I like to say that this case is very, very gruesome. I will give you another warning before I actually get into all the gruesome details and stuff. But yeah, it's it was hard for me to hear the details the first time I heard about this case. It was hard for me to read about the details when I researched the case, and it's been hard for me to sit through and try to talk about it too. And this is about the fourth time that I've covered or gone through covering this case. So yeah, so it's very gruesome. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. So, growing up, Andre lived in Grayson County, Texas. He lived with his mother and his 5 brothers. His father, I believe, was also in his life. I think it was a little bit more sporadically than how much his mother was involved in his life and his siblings' lives. They were not well off growing up. They spent a lot of their time in church. So his mother and his father both had their own set of issues. His mother mainly raised him and his siblings, but she also suffered from mental illness and thought that she was receiving messages from God. There were also several reports that indicated that Andre's father suffered from alcoholism. At school, his classmates said that he was very eager to share Bible stories. He was very respectful, he didn't complain, and just seemed like an all-around nice kid. He also had a love for cars. He was known as being like a tinkerer, like he would take things apart and put them back together, and that sort of thing. And he said he wanted to be a car designer when he grew up. Okay, so Andre started hearing voices in his head around age 9. He heard things like angels and demons arguing, and in an attempt to drown out these voices, Andre began drinking at a young age. His first suicide attempt came when he was still in elementary school, when he slit his wrists open. Around age 13, he began smoking weed, and this was also the next age of his next suicide attempt when he cut his wrists with a butcher knife. Around age 15, Andre started to have some run-ins with the law. This is also around the age where he met and fell in love with a girl named Laura Boren. Laura soon became pregnant and gave birth to their son Andre Jr. in 2000. When Andre was 18 and Laura was 17, the couple married. But only a few months after they got married, the couple separated. Laura then eventually moved on and had another child named Leah with another man. From about 2000 until 2002, Andre accrued over 20 minor charges, ranging from driving without a license to minor in possession and consumption of alcohol. Around this time, it just seemed that Andre's mental state just continued to get worse and worse. I found multiple sources that said Andre would duct tape his mouth shut for days at a time. He also started using a cold medicine named Coricidin on top of using weed and alcohol to help self-medicate. He had a hard time keeping a job to help support his family, and about a month or so leading up to the tragic day that I'm getting ready to tell you about, Andre went to a mental health clinic and a hospital after 2 separate suicide attempts. Unfortunately, he left both of those places without getting any kind of treatment. Okay, so before I get into March 27th, 2004, the day that all of this happened, I'm going to give one last gruesome warning. And I know I hear you. You're probably saying you don't need it. I get it, but I'm just saying the details of the murders that happened this day and some of the details of some of the things that happened after the murders are very gruesome and very hard to listen to, and they're very hard for me to sit here and tell you about. So, okay, last one. I'm just saying. Okay. In the early morning hours, around 7 a.m. on March 27, 2004, Andre kicked in the door to the home of his estranged wife. Her boyfriend, I believe, was not home at the time. I believe the story goes that he had already gone to work by the time that Andre got there. So Andre kicks down the door. He breaks into the house. He then walks into the bedroom where Laura and her boyfriend shared. He then stabbed Laura to death and cut out a piece of her lung that he thought was her heart. He then took a separate knife and went into the room that the kids were sharing, and he then stabbed his own son, Andre Jr., to death and cut out his heart. And then with a separate knife, he stabbed Laura and her boyfriend's daughter, Leah, to death and cut out her heart. I know I kind of already said, but I just want to reiterate that Andre used 3 separate knives for each victim. So then, either while Andre was still at the scene of the crime or right after he decided to leave the house, he stabbed himself 3 times in the chest. So Andre then decides to leave Laura's house and walk to his dad's house. And on his way to his dad's house, he decides to call Laura, the woman he just murdered, who obviously does not pick up the phone. So then he proceeds to call her parents, and they also do not pick up the phone. But he left them a voicemail that went something like this: Sherry, this is Andre. I need y'all's help. Something bad is happening to me, and it keeps happening. I don't know what's going on. I need help. I think I'm in hell. I need help. Someone needs to come and help me. I need help bad. I'm desperate. I'm afraid to go to sleep. So when you get this message, can you come by the house, please? Hello? Okay, so after leaving this voicemail for Laura's parents, he then arrives at his dad's house where he encounters a family member. I'm not sure, I can't remember if it's his dad, and there weren't a lot of sources that really said, but he comes in contact with a family member. He tells them what he did, and they're like, you need to go to the police. So he does. So he walks to the police station, the Sherman County Police Department, and turns himself in. When he gets there, he's bleeding from his stab wounds, and he is arrested by a detective. Andre was then taken to a local hospital where his injuries were treated. He was then released on March 9th, and he was transported to the Grayson County Jail. About 6 days after his arrest, Andre removed his right eye. Before Andre's trial, there were 2 court-ordered psychologists that determined that he was not competent to stand trial. But after Andre was sent away to get treatment for about 6 weeks at the Texas Department of Mental Health and Retardation at Vernon campus, the chief psychologist there concluded that he thought Andre was just exaggerating his symptoms and said that he was in a state of drug-induced psychosis at the time of the murders. So basically stating that Andre's mental illness was not the driving force for the murders, and it was because he was using drugs to help self-medicate. Help self-medicate his mental illness. So basically the psychologist was saying that because he was doing so many drugs, that was the driving force as to why he committed the murders, and that his mental illness and his symptoms either weren't that bad or weren't bad enough to affect his thinking and reasoning during the murders. So the chief psychologist saying that he was exaggerating his mental illness symptoms and that he was in a drug-induced psychosis at the time of the murders then declared that Andre was competent to stand trial. So after that determination was made, he was then sent back to the Grayson County Jail. Okay, so one thing that I think is very important to note is that Andre's lawyer had an opportunity to request a competency hearing, basically a pre-trial hearing where they could, in greater depth, discuss the different opinions of the psychologists that had met with him and made determinations about his mental illness. So he had an opportunity to request a hearing to better look at those things, and his lawyer did not ask for that. I'm not sure for what reason. I'm not sure if he thought maybe it wouldn't make a difference because of the opinion of the chief psychologist or what. But in my opinion, I thought that it wouldn't hurt the situation, at least to fight a little bit harder to maybe reverse the decision that he is competent to stand trial, but he did not ask for that hearing. Another important note about the trial, or the pre-trial decisions, I guess, is that there were multiple jurors that were not contested by Andre's defense team, and these jurors were openly against interracial marriages like the one that Andre and Laura were in. So I hadn't mentioned it before, but Andre is black and Laura was white. So there were jurors that didn't like that, that were not contested by Andre's defense team. I'm not sure if that was pure laziness or if it was more that they ran out of times they could contest a juror. So I'm not quite sure what happened there. I think it's also important to note that every single person in the jury was white. So I don't have a ton of information about the trial. I also couldn't really find like video footage of it or anything, but I also think it's very obvious that it clearly was Andre who committed these murders. So I don't think there was a lot going into necessarily the whole did he do it. It's more what should his punishment should be for a crime like this. So the trial began in February of 2005. I read many sources that said throughout the entire trial, Andre just sat there with an eye patch over his eye, the eye that he had removed previously, eating Skittles as the evidence was being presented. After all of the evidence was presented, the jury recommended that he be sentenced to death, and the judge upheld their decision or recommendation, and Andre was then sentenced to death. He was then sent to Pulaski unit in Livingston. While on death row, Andre took out his remaining eye and ate it. He also then made more suicide attempts, one that resulted in him getting 8 sutures to close the wound that he had cut in his throat. He also attacked a fellow inmate and had to be sprayed with chemical spray to be subdued. Okay, so here I'm going to kind of circle back to how I was saying that in the beginning that Andre is in no way a victim of this case or this story, but I think that the way it was handled by our justice system is really sad to see. I think that Andre is very, very obviously mentally ill, and I just kind of want to go back over all the reasons why I think he's very obviously mentally ill, and that even though he is not the victim of this case, that his case could have and should have been handled better or in different ways to get a better outcome for Andre. So kind of circling back to the beginning, Andre started hearing voices in his head at a very young age, like I said before, and given that Andre's family sometimes could not afford electricity, I think it's very obvious that they were not well off enough for him to get the kind of mental health help, therapy, medicine, all that stuff that Andre needed and really could have used. Also, family history of mental illness, like I mentioned earlier, his mother did say that she received messages from God and very, very much believed that she received messages from God, which are probably, or it's probably similar to the kind of voices that Andre was hearing at a young age and when he got older as well. Another thing that I think is very obvious that shows how mentally not well he was that he used separate knives for each victim. That was something that stuck out to me immediately when I first listened to this story, when I first heard this story on the other podcast, because to me that's just a clear indicator of, like, it's just not necessary. You know what? Like, and I don't know why any killer or person in their right mind would go out of their way to use 3 separate weapons for each person unless like the knives were breaking or something like that, but that was not the case in this one. I don't believe any of the knives broke or anything. So the reason he used 3 separate knives for each victim, so not only did God tell him that he should kill his family, the voices in his head also told him that he had to kill them to release their souls because Laura was a Jezebel and his son Andre Jr. was the Antichrist. And the only way to free their souls was to kill them without cross-contaminating their blood. So that was the reason for the 3 separate knives. And then one of the biggest ones to me is the phone call that I read little script of what he said to Laura's parents after he had killed Laura. Not only is what he says on the phone call concerning as far as his mental health, but so is the fact that he, after murdering his estranged wife, he then tried to call her on the phone. So if that's not a clear indication of mental illness, I'm not quite sure what is. And then the message that message, it just to me so clearly shows how very mentally ill he was. I mean, he said he needed help, 5 to 7 times, and maybe a 4-line voicemail that I have typed out here. He says he's desperate. He's afraid to go to sleep. So, yeah. The fact that he tried to call his estranged wife that he had just murdered and then left that voicemail for her parents on their phone, I think is a very clear indicator of his mental illness, even not in concoction with the other things, other pieces of evidence, I would say, that show his mental illness. Yeah, and so then after he was arrested, he removed one of his eyes, and then after his trial was over, he removed his other eye, leaving him completely blind. Oh, and then before ever being arrested, he would duct tape his mouth shut for days at a time. So I think there are so many clear indicators that Andre was clearly never mentally stable, at least not from a young age, was not mentally stable. So it's very frustrating to me that after being deemed not competent to stand trial by 2 psychologists, the head psychologist at a treatment center that Andre was at said that he was in a drug-induced psychosis and was exaggerating his symptoms. And it's just so frustrating that one psychologist's determination or opinion completely trumped the other 2 that had come previously. I mean, obviously, I don't think that self-medicating your mental illnesses with drugs and alcohol is a good idea, or that it helps your mental state get better. But I definitely would not say that it was, at least from what I've seen, it was not the driving force for Andre's crime that he committed. So it's absolutely frustrating to me that one opinion was taken much more into account than the other one, than others that had been given previously. And I absolutely think that if Andre had been able to get the kind of help that he needed at an earlier age, it could have definitely prevented something like this ever happening. Another thing that I mentioned earlier, but I want to reiterate that I feel was completely unfair that happened in this case, was just Andre's lawyer not trying to get him a competency hearing after being declared competent to stand trial. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if his defense team just thought it wasn't going to help him, like it was pointless. I think that they should have at least tried to ask for the time to be taken out for him being competent to stand trial, like that decision to be more heavily looked at and more closely looked at. Because like I said, 2 out of 3 psychologists said that he was not competent to stand trial. So I just think it makes me upset that they didn't even request a competency hearing when they apparently could have done so. So yeah, so here I want to get a little bit deeper into some of the quotes and more specific opinions of some of the other psychologists that examined Andre, other than like the chief psychologist at the Texas Department of Mental Health and Retardation at Vernon campus. So this quote comes from Dr. Edward Grippon. He was appointed by the judge of Andre's case to assist the defense team in preparing their insanity defense. And so he makes a comment about what Andre's mental state could have been like on the day of the murders. He says, "I believe that he was operating under the effect of a psychotic illness at the time, specifically schizophrenia, in which he believed that he was doing what was directed by, or that he was at least operating under the direction of God, in fighting these demons, saving the world, and that was all based upon a psychosis, and he did not know that his conduct was wrong." Unfortunately, Dr. Grippon was not called to testify at trial. I am not sure why. Okay, so another doctor that examined Andre, Dr. Kate Allen, was actually called to comment on Andre's future dangerousness. She testified that she interviewed him and had reviewed documents that were relevant to looking at his childhood, his development, and his functioning. She concluded that the convicted killer suffered from schizophrenia and that this mental illness was the driving force which made him commit the crimes for which he was being tried. The doctor finally concluded that with the proper treatment and medication, his future dangerousness would be diminished. Although she was called to testify at the trial, she was not actually called until the penalty phase of the trial, meaning that Andre had already been found guilty. They were just trying to figure out his punishment or penalty at this point. So while I was researching, I found that what most of the jurors wanted to hear from Andre was this like true remorse for the murders. And I'd like to remind you that he sat there with an eye patch over his eye, eating Skittles the entire time, like not making a face, from what I understand. So I think that's a pretty sorry, it's not funny, but like to picture someone just sitting there with an eye patch over their eye eating Skittles while these like horrific details of these murders they committed are just being presented, like it's such a cold thing to picture. Sorry. So I think that's a lot. I think that's a lot to ask of someone who is sitting there eating Skittles while all of these horrific details are being recounted. So, and I think it's just an unfair expectation or thing to ask of him, because like the quote from the first doctor, Dr. Grippon, that I read, he was under the not under the assumption, but he, in his headspace, he thought that he was receiving messages from God, or under the direction of God, and God was telling him to kill his family. So in his mind, he was freeing their souls and doing what he was told to do by God. So I don't think that I don't think he has remorse, and I don't think he would have been able to express that. I don't know that he would be able to express that even now, just given that based off of what these doctors have said, it doesn't seem like he knew what he was doing was wrong or believed it was wrong. I feel like what the jury really should have been looking for or questioning is if Andre knew what he was doing was wrong at the time. And if I were a juror on that jury and that's what we were looking for or examining, I would say the answer to that is no. Like I had mentioned previously, there were also people who served on the jury that were against interracial marriages, like the one that Andre and Laura were in. So that was another way that I just feel like, with the way that this case was handled and other things, this case was very much stacked against Andre before it even started, or the trial was, I guess. So yeah, and like I said, not that the fact that Andre was mentally ill or is mentally ill makes it okay for what happened. This is a very tragic thing that happened. Andre is not the victim of this story. I just feel that we need to do better for people who are mentally ill, as far as our justice system goes, even when they do horrible things. Because if they're doing horrible things and they don't understand the gravity of what they're doing, or if they're doing it for reasons like Andre, where he thinks he's being told by God that he needs to kill his family, we need to take that into account and not treat them as if they're the same as a sane-minded, cold-blooded killer, because in my mind they are not the same. Andre now lives in Buford H. Jester 5 unit in Richmond, Texas. Andre's case is now going through the appeal process, partly because his original lawyers did not do their jobs properly. So the last little quote that I want to read to you is actually from Andre himself. It was put out in the Texas Tribune by Brandy Grissom, who wrote an article for them. And she, in the article, when doing research and talking to him, was able to ask him if Andre knows why the state wants to execute him. And he said, "They don't want me to fulfill my purpose. That would make me superior. They don't want me to be superior. Because I'm black, but that's not all of it." She said he told her, "I know I was convicted, but I don't understand why I was convicted. So that is really all that I've got for the Andre Thomas case. I just can't understand how we got to this outcome through our justice system, although I guess I shouldn't say that because our justice system does not work, and I should know that by now. But I can't understand how someone could look at all of these things that one person did and say, yeah, he is competent to stand trial. I can't understand how you could do that to someone, and like I said, even though Andre did these horrible things, I'm still left feeling very bad for him in certain ways. I feel like his case could have been handled differently. He should have got a better and more fair trial. Yeah, so that is all that I've really got. Next up, I have coming. I'm working on the Paul Durasow case, I believe is how you say it. So I've been researching and outlining for that for the last little bit. So that will be the next case coming up here pretty soon. Andre's case was one that I had written about on the blog, so I kind of already had all this information ready to go for me. So I kind of wanted to pick something that I hadn't done yet, and get into that. So I'm very excited to get this one out to you guys and start working on the next episode for you guys. I know I said I was going to be a little bit more consistent. I am trying to get back to being more consistent with things like with me coming out at work and having to deal with stuff like that. I kind of took another break from everything just to give myself like space and time to deal with that stuff. But it seems that things are getting better, hopefully. So so hopefully I should be back to feeling a little bit better and having more energy for this type of stuff. So thank you so much for sticking with me through this episode. It was a tough one. It's also my first full episode back, so I'm a little bit rusty. I feel like I'm kind of a little bit all over the place, so I apologize. But I'm very happy to have finished my first episode back. So yeah, I will see you guys next time. In the meantime, please stay safe to the best of your ability, and remember, ask questions, investigate things for yourself, and draw your own conclusions. In other words, don't follow the herd.